in a university. At universities in the US, Canada, and Portugal. I discovered your work first by reading an article about Hannah Arendt and phenomenology, because I had myself to write a chapter about Hannah Arendt and phenomenology, and it was for me quite a shock. So thank you again for this. And today your work spans the fields of environmental philosophy and ecological thought. Political theory and phenomenology, of course. And we are going to talk a bit more today about your current writings and works. Thank you again for being here today.
Thank you both. So just a short word about the format. So first we'll have a short presentation by Michael, and then it will be followed by a short presentation on the theme by Gayle, on the theme of forms of collective phenomenology. And then Lucie and I will ask some questions to the panelists, and we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. So if you can just all stop your mic if you're not speaking, that would be great. And Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Leo and Lucie, for the invitation and for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you, and especially to be in conversation with Gayle. I'm really looking forward to it. And in the spirit of a kind of dialogic engagement, I will keep my more formal remarks very brief, because I think the more interesting part will be really engaging in a conversation and in a dialogue, and trying to see where our different conceptions of phenomenology touch, where they diverge, and what is interesting maybe even about these very divergences. These brief remarks that I'm going to offer are offered to you in the spirit of provocations, possibly triggering the discussion that is to come. And I would claim, in the context of the title of our panel, Forms of Collective Phenomenology, that phenomenology is always collective, or at the very least associative. The very dynamic structure of consciousness as intentionality, as a directedness toward, in Husserl, is an associative one, even if intentionality does not aim at anything in the outside world, if what is intended is a part of my own inner experience, a memory, a hope, an anticipation, and so on. It can gather me with the intended other, or momentarily with myself, this dynamic structure of intentionality. If indeed I intend myself, this self-referential intentionality does not merely close the circle, say, of the touching and the touched in and by the same living body, as in Merleau-Ponty. We all know this famous example in Merleau-Ponty of what happens if I touch myself, if my hand touches my other hand. Rather, it is a sign of an unreachable destination, assuming that who or what I'm associated with includes other than human, animal, and vegetal aspects of my own vitality, my own corporeality and psychic life. So it is not just another human other that I touch, even when I touch myself, but perhaps other deeper strata of our embodiment and of our psychic constitution. So the phenomenological notion of consciousness is anything but a hidden drawer for storing experiences, memories, hopes, desires, etc. Never really locked in itself, it is a stretch, or more precisely a stretching toward the other. Since the stretching always happens between at least two, the intending and the intended, it is inherently associative. I cannot in this context avoid mentioning phenomenological plant consciousness, which I have been studying for the last decade and a half or so. In plants, intentionality is extended. Dynamic intention takes the shape of extension, of growth. That is to say that vegetal intentionality is spatialized. And this, strange as it may sound, this makes it actually easier to study psychic processes phenomenologically, including those pertaining to attention, memory, and communication tout court. Perhaps in human beings, there's also something of an extended intentionality, intimately bound to the lived and living body, but it is or has been thoroughly repressed. After all, as I've already mentioned, the human and the animal and the vegetal are not monolithic entities. We humans are shot through psychically and corporeally with other modes of existence, often without realizing this. If so, then the associative bent of phenomenology would require us to lift the millennia-old repression of this inhabitation of the human by the other than human, in order, for instance, to allow the vegetal in us to stretch toward the plant outside. Now, at the same time, the associative capacity of phenomenology should not be conflated with forms of collectivity. Collective needs to be heard in the literal key of a tying or gathering with, colligare, with the Greek verb legein, from which logos is derived, not very far off from this Latin etymology. So collective, I would claim, goes back to the origin of phenomenology, to the very meaning of phenomenology, precisely as a phenomenology, the logos part in this expression. Insofar as phenomenology is a phenomenology, it is collective or recollective, gathering together the phenomena that fleetingly appear on the horizons of experience. Far from totalization, the gathering that entails a linking, a binding, a tying of knots, in psychoanalysis this is called cathexis, is focused on what lies between the interrelated terms, the in-between that precisely always slips away from every totalizing grasp. So this collective gathering, again, is not totalization, but the focusing on the middle, on the tying of the knots, the links, the binds between two or more terms. Now, throughout my work, I have been trying to track the permutations of the in-between, of this middle, variously called life or existence. I have argued that life, vegetal life above all, begins axiomatically in, from, and with the middle, where distinctions are never razor sharp, where things melt into one another at their edges, and the inside twists out into the outside. And it, life, existence, ends in the middle as well. Existence is submerged in finitude without absolute starting points and finish lines, dangling or plunging in a perpetual middle. What philosophical movement other than phenomenology is propitious to at once free and structured, open and methodically precise approach to existence so conceived? I still put my philosophical trust in phenomenology precisely because I think that it leads us to this ever-present middle without imprisoning it in any rigid structures or congealed forms of experience. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you so much, Michael. Gayle, we are happy to listen to you now.
There we go, unmuted. All right, success. Hi, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Leo and Lucie, for organizing our panel. I'm really excited to be in conversation on this topic, and also with Michael Marder, from whom I'm always learning about things I thought I already knew about: plants, dust, fire. I'm also excited to be here because I'm starting this new project thinking about collective phenomenology, but this is the first time I've been able to think it with anyone. So, so thanks to you all for attending, particularly because there's some stiff competition in this time slot. There's some very compelling and horrifying things being televised at this moment unrelated to collective phenomenology, or perhaps not unrelated. So some thoughts about what collective phenomenology might be. The phrase collective phenomenology might upon first encounter strike us as odd or even nonsensical. After all, phenomenology is typically understood to be a philosophy engaging the relation between the appearance of the world and the one who perceives it, where those perceptions are grounded in the embodiment of an individual subject. Phenomenology is thus frequently characterized as a philosophy attuned to and concerned with individual subjectivity. In this common understanding of phenomenology, it is a decidedly depopulated or even solipsistic enterprise, one that cannot lay claim properly to insights about politics or ethics or the social realm. However, One need not but scratch the surface of phenomenological thought in any direction to find that what might at first appear to be an inquiry restricted to questions of individual personhood is in fact rich with resources for thinking collectivity, and indeed for thinking collectively. It's true that phenomenology is concerned with what things feel like and the description of the qualitative character of experience. This would seem to make our inquiry about consciousness and therefore necessarily about individuals. Describing what things feel like, things including objects, encounters, mood states, and so on, is of course not the particular province of phenomenology. Literary fiction, anthropology, sociology, and a host of other disciplines might be said to proceed by way of describing experience. But phenomenology reads these articulations of experience through the essential structures that make them possible. Instead of viewing experience as inescapably subjective and thus necessarily restricted to the survey of an individual mind or singular consciousness, phenomenology tries to discover the points of contact where consciousness and the world are joined. If Husserl's investment was to uncover the structures by which the world and consciousness were brought together, structures which he understood to be universal, shared by all experience havers, then it might be said that at least a weak form of collectivity is already contained at the heart of even the most abstract iterations of transcendental phenomenology. Perhaps true, and yet not an entirely satisfying answer to the question of how phenomenology collectively. Given that much phenomenology nevertheless does not seem to delve too deeply into the shared nature of the life world it is tasked to understand, if Husserl is not of enough help to us here, at least not until the crisis of the European sciences, we can nevertheless find a robust legacy in the history of philosophers who used phenomenology to think about sociology and collectivity. Alfred Schutz, Aaron Gurvitch, Maurice Natanson, Edith Stein, Erwin Strauss, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Richard Zehner, to name but a few.
I should think that's cool.
That some of these figures are now remembered more vividly in other disciplines than they are in philosophy may say more about what in our contemporary scene counts as proper philosophy than anything else.
Yeah.
One of the names that belongs in that list is the subject of my current research, Herbert Spiegelberg. I've just started a project looking at Spiegelberg's work. Within philosophy, Herbert Spiegelberg is remembered, when he's remembered at all, as the author of The Phenomenological Movement, a 2-volume doorstopper published in 1960. The Phenomenological Movement is a book that chronicles the phenomenological tradition in the mode of a historical survey, offering chapters on its antecedents, Husserl, its founder, its most well-known figures, and also some of its lesser-known practitioners. The Phenomenological Movement is Herbert Spiegelberg's most well-known contribution to philosophy, and it is, to be fair, still pretty obscure. But I would argue that it is not, in fact, his most important contribution to continental philosophy. Between 1965 and 1972, Spiegelberg ran a series of 5 summer workshops at Washington University in St. Louis. The participants were graduate students from all over the country. The idea for the workshops was first hatched at the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy conference at Evanston in 1962. Some of the activities of these workshops did not stray too far from the familiar evening lectures by eminences followed by a Q&A. But most of the workshop activities and their reason for being was quite unconventional. Spiegelberg locked the doors of the library and had the students perform a series of perceptual experiments outside the library, both jointly and collectively, the results of which they then reported back to the larger group. He was invested in introducing students to the study of phenomenology through the concrete doing of phenomenology. Spiegelberg's aim with these workshops was twofold. First, he wanted to break out of the arid and sterile realms of what he called metaphenomenology, the textual and historical study of philosophy. Direct experiments with perception, he believed, would allow students a chance to get back to the things themselves. Secondly, and not unrelatedly, he wanted to break phenomenology out of the solipsistic and subjectivist framework it was often interpreted as necessarily inhabiting. As Spiegelberg himself put it, his objective, quote, was to free phenomenology from the seemingly utter privacy and subjectivity, if not solipsism, to which, according to certain interpretations of the Husserlian conception, it is doomed, unquote. He continues, quote, what I would like to show is that there is nothing in the nature of the phenomenological approach that confines it to isolated practice, that it can be performed like any other observation in groups as well as in isolation, and that these groups could and should communicate, unquote. Indeed, Spiegelberg would argue that the workshop format he devised, involving participants working together collectively to interrogate phenomena, was not just one possible way to do phenomenology, it was perhaps the ideal way to do firsthand phenomenology. And I want to read a quotation from him. Quote, I thought that cooperative phenomenology could perhaps overcome the seemingly hopeless stalemate between contradictory intuitions of individual phenomenologists. The usual defeatism in this regard seemed to me unwarranted and premature. By concerted effort to explore and narrow down clashes, by entering sympathetically and empathetically into one another's perspectives, and by pointing out overlooked aspects of phenomena, at least some of the alleged chaos of subjectivities could be overcome in an intersubjectivity, which might better be called co-subjectivity, a term used before and in a somewhat different sense by Gabriel Marcel, unquote. Phenomenologist Ed Casey was a participant in several of these workshops. I was thinking about Casey's work on edges when Michael was talking about plants and edges. So Ed Casey was a participant in several of these workshops and describes them as uniquely able to enact a kind of group attunement that is rare in philosophical activity. Casey called it sim philosophizing, taking the name from a postcard that Edmund Husserl wrote to Herbert Spiegelberg. And I'm going to quote from Ed Casey here, quote, workshops foster the we phenomenon, in Herbert's phrase, the co-subjectivity in Marcel's term that would offset the supposed solipsism of this same enterprise, unquote. Which of these terms we use to describe the project of collective phenomenology depends, I think, on which aspects of collectivity we want to emphasize. Intersubjectivity carries the ease of being a familiar term and the additional imprimatur of being a Husserlian coinage, yet it seems to name a condition of being rather than an activity or a method. Sim philosophizing is the name that Husserl gave to the project of jointly pursued philosophy in that postcard that he wrote to Spiegelberg, inviting him to join him in the project of collective phenomenology, though this term perhaps suffers from a lack of clarity. The we phenomenon has been taken up by Dan Zahavi and Andrew Calcagno in their discussion of Edith Stein's phenomenology of empathy. But it seems to me that the term co-philosophizing, Spiegelberg's preferred term for the jointly pursued project of phenomenology, has the advantage of echoing the co-presence that Husserl describes at length, as well as underscoring the intersubjective nature of the task and the group attunement that results from its practice. I'll stop there just to say that it's that matter of group attunement that I find particularly interesting about these workshops that that Spiegelberg was running, and more to say about that to be sure, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Gayle. Very inspiring. So many things to say. We want to ask you both some questions, but first, Michael, do you have any reaction to Gayle so that we can just jump in the conversation?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Gayle, for this wonderful presentation. And of course, for thinking about Ed Casey's work on edges in relation to my work on plants, because Ed Casey is a dear friend of mine, of course, and was a teacher at the New School when I was a graduate student there as well. So it's not surprising that our ways of thinking are also converging in some ways here. But the immediate reaction I have is in relation to this term sim philosophizing, which I didn't know before, and thank you for bringing it to our attention. I do think that this is a very promising term, also in the literal key in which philosophy needs to be understood not as a dispassionate pursuit of reason by the intellect, but literally as the love of Sophia, a love, a kind of an attraction, a love of wisdom. So there is, as we know, not only from Husserl, but also from psychoanalysis, there is kind of a definite psychic investment in the object of love, what I before mentioned as cathexis, right? This term linking or binding the ties between beings, between people. So it would be very promising indeed, I think, to think about this experience of sim philosophizing in relation to the non-detached and in fact, the loving Sophia with others together in the company of others. Of course, to my mind, it's always a question of who these others are, because in the experiments that you described, of course, these are other phenomenologists or phenomenologists in training who participate in this experiment. But it's, at least from my point of view, it's interesting, of course, to extend this relation not only to other philosophers or phenomenologists, but people who are also in some way or another non-indifferent, attached to the very phenomena that are being investigated. They can be artists, or they can be thinkers coming from completely other fields than philosophy. And then, of course, also non-human or other than human forms of life. Why should they be outside of this community of sim philosophizing, of kind of joint love of wisdom that does not need to be purely symbolic or related to the notion of rationality as normally understood? Yeah, sorry,
That's so great. That's so great, and I love that you're reminding us that that when these terms get sort of restricted into the funnel of rational discourse, then we're really sort of losing a lot of their possibility. And that term sim philosophizing or sim phenomenologizing, I think that was actually the title of a piece that Ed Casey wrote about Spiegelberg's workshops. So I should send that. So he has a lot to say about that term. One of the things that was particularly compelling to me about it, and one of the things that Spiegelberg talks about a lot is it ends up being a lot about listening, right? Which in a way can seem rather passive, but he was really trying to deliberately kind of break the sort of agonistic form through which we are so accustomed to pursuing philosophy. Like, okay, you give your argument, and then I wait patiently, forming what I'm going to say, and then I give my rejoinder. And he was really, it's really astounding. He was really kind of trying to undo sort of that rhetorical template through which we, battle in philosophy and indeed in life. and that's one of the things that I find sort of so promising about trying to think collectively, both sort of in the realm of rational discourse and of course also outside of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We already have some questions online, but before we had a few questions with Leo, so we are just going to ask maybe one or two of them. Me, I had a question. I know that, Gayle, you've shared that there is no methodology or precise methodology, but still I was wondering, what does it mean to practice phenomenology collectively? And for example, if we consider a plant or something that we wouldn't consider like every day, maybe. But, so yeah, I would be curious to have your opinion, maybe a vignette or something you can imagine to illustrate what does it mean to this phenomenology collectively.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems to me, and because I'm so immersed in these workshops right now, I'm thinking a lot about that. But the first thing it means is to cultivate a certain kind of receptivity or listening. The thing that's interesting about that is that it makes collective phenomenologizing, of course, necessarily an ethical practice, which seems particularly important. But it also seems to me that not just phenomenology practiced collectively, but also that phenomenology can give us a particular kind of access to collective behavior. So my last book was about a criminal trial and a sort of phenomenological reading of how things in the courtroom were unfolding, like a phenomenological reading of how meaning was being disclosed and exchanged in the courtroom. So it seems to me that phenomenology can work both as a collective practice, but also as a practice to sort of see collectivities at work.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to add something?
Yes, thank you. I think that really, thank you for correcting the sim philosophizing, sim phenomenologizing, even though the two are completely co-imbricated and bound to one another. But it seems to me that this kind of sim phenomenologizing specifically is something that I could subscribe to methodologically if it involves a common, shared attunement to the things themselves, whatever is of concern, whatever attracts our attention and interests us. And then also through that attunement to a common, let's say, object, being with that object, being with one another. So attunement to one another, gathered around the object of concern, which is not really an object, but in fact is also always a subject. So in this sense, I think that I would like to bring it to the more concrete case of learning. For instance, if we take, in English, we always say we learn from the other. But in fact, in Spanish and Portuguese, one says learning with, one learns with the other, aprender con or con. And so you always learn with those from whom you learn, right? To me, this is a very important point, and one that is applicable more generally to what we could call collective phenomenology. And going back to an ancient intuition, which we find, say, in Parmenides, this basic withness of thinking, this being with of thinking that redoubles the being with of being itself, right? There is no way to be without being with others. There is no way to think without thinking with others, right? These two statements necessarily go together. And I think that Heidegger, to his credit, with his notion of Mitsein or Mitdasein, points in the same direction, even though he's very restrictive, of course, in ontological terms, in terms of who counts as Dasein. But this Mitsein and Mitdasein are a promising cue that we could take from Heidegger in this respect. I mean, in terms of more concrete experiments that I've done, I've myself participated in terms of such collective phenomenology, of course, it is oriented toward plants, but recognizing that plants themselves are subjects of experience with their own world. So approaching plants is already a kind of an intersection of two worlds, of different intentionalities, mine and that of the plant, and then my repressed vegetal intentionality and the intentionalities outside of me. And then when I work with let's say human others, be they philosophers or plant scientists or artists who are also interested in learning with plants, not only from plants, but learning with plants, then this creates a very complex scene of doing phenomenology in this non-formal, deformalized way, because even though I keep to some of the basics of the phenomenological method, of course, the plant scientists interested in the subject of plant intelligence or artists I collaborate with, we all share this kind of preoccupation with plants as centers of their own meaning, of their own world-making activity. And then our own interpersonal, let's say, relations are adjusted based on this shared acknowledgement, which is, as Gayle said, absolutely rightly, is ethical. At its core, phenomenology has to be ethical, understood in a sense.
Thank you very much for this, for being with plants. It's an idea that I will remind. We had some reactions on the chat. Damien, would you like to share your question?
Yeah, I was very interested in this notion of the middle and how to get in there, having grappled with that in my own work over the years. I wondered though, how does one get into that middle, which is also a muddle, of course, very etymologically close in English, that the middle is a muddle. How do you get into that though, other than via the established oppositions and dualisms of Western thinking? Now, my problem is, if these dualisms are, as we, I think, agreed, phantasms, isn't anything else derived from them doubly phantasmal, therefore?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question and a very pertinent one. I could just spend hours trying to respond to it and would never do justice to this, but let me try to summarize. The idea for me is to precisely start with the middle, not to start. So it's a change of perspective. We do not start with the extremes and then see what is excluded between them, right? This is precisely a non-starter, because that leads us into the principle of non-contradiction, and then it subverts the kind of negation of the principle of non-contradiction. Rather, the change of perspective that I have in mind is starting from the middle and then moving toward the extremes from there, polarizing, as it were, out of the middle. So even though the structure seems to be the same, the starting point from the middle gives us a very different experience of this. And I have to say that very concretely, I learned this with plants, or from or with plants, as you could say. So if you take a germinating seed, which is precisely a middle of existence, it's usually understood as a kind of end product of a previous cycle of plant life. But in fact, it's a midpoint between one cycle of growth and another, which is not guaranteed, of course. The seed may never germinate, it may never retain, it may only retain its potential, germinative potential. But nonetheless, the seed is already a middle. And how does it germinate? It starts precisely polarizing in two directions. It needs to determine phenomenologically what is down and what is up. On this depends the fate of this germinating seed, because it cannot grow roots upward and the shoot downward, because then it will be unviable, right? So it has specific physiological and biochemical mechanisms that let it interpret its environment precisely in terms of up and down, phenomenologically. And from there, this polarization of growth begins growing up and down simultaneously, these different structures. So in some of my recent work that is still unpublished, I try to follow in thought this movement of a germinating seed, precisely elongating out of the middle toward the extremes, and not try to locate this elusive middle, looking at it from out of the extremes themselves. So hopefully this gives you just a bit of a hint on your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Gayle, would you like to add something or react? Or
no, I'll leave the middle to Michael there. I love that image of the germinating seed. Yeah, that was lovely.
I think Pierre was next at least in the comment section on Zoom. So maybe Pierre, you may develop on your comments online if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. This is fascinating stuff, very exciting things, as you say in America, excited. But Damien, and Michael, I mean, this kind of middle is not a Wechselspiel in the Kantian version of the matter and form, and finding something in between. It starts there. And isn't it so, Damien, that Husserl and the phenomenology develop? How did it develop? How did it come? Maybe it ends up somewhere in the middle, but how did it start? Well, as a criticism of psychology. And comes to an idea which cropped up when I listened to you is, are we now in the phase of starting to criticize seriously sociology? And Hunter was, I'm coming back to your keynote, as is the keynote, one should come back to the keynote, saying that there is a paradigm. And in this paradigm that has dominated organizational studies, it's clear that sociologists have been taken over. And just think about Schütz's wonderful, subtle kind of remarks on Talcott Parson and his clumsiness. Huh? So that would, and final kind of hint, also suggestion where I would go and where I found something which is quite inspiring is Pierre Hadot's way of looking at philosophizing as what he calls spiritual exercises. You can't say this without ending up in some kind of theology mumbo jumbo thing, huh? As you must say collective in order to be politically relevant, okay? But instead, Pierre Hadot is speaking about the cosmic and the spiritual exercises as something maybe in between. I mean, there is something in between, and there is a task for philosophy to make us attuned to that without jumping into spirituality and theology and mindfulness and all that kind of crap.
If I may,
Gayle,
Gayle.
yeah, we would love to hear from Gayle. Like, Gayle, do you have any feedback or reaction on what Pierre just said?
That seems so right, that we're so bad about talking about collectivity, that or sort of connectedness, that immediately it sort of zings off into the spiritual realm. That seems really right to me, that we don't have a rich enough vocabulary within philosophy for talking about interconnectedness. So I think that go ahead.
The problem, one of the problems, of course, which is hovering all over here, is that the transcendence is sort of, is obviously banned from the discussion, and it becomes sort of spiritual. And we don't have, you see, I can't even speak about it myself. I'm stuttering. So yeah. And it's not the intersubjectivity, I would say. We know what we're not after, but we don't know where we want to go. And that's the exciting thing with the project. I don't know. Yeah.
Just a reaction from Damien, if you want to pursue the dialogue.
Yes, I mean, I was just struck there by, there is something that, as Pierre said, there is something, it's kind of like an affirmation of faith almost, which I'm not saying I'm averse to. I mean, maybe that is where we start from, but isn't it still a quest for more and bigger and better, more expansive circles of consciousness, inter-subjective, inter-animal, inter-plant, you know, evermore, a quest for evermore? It's kind of like, in a way, it's kind of like the fate of Western thinking itself. And at the moment, yes, sociology probably is dead, Pierre, but you know, what about less? You know, that, I mentioned Lem Solaris before I was rudely cut off. I think Lem Solaris is about the limits of the human, what it can't do, or when it reaches its limits and what happens. And, you know, and a shrinking, not a expansive consciousness into collectivities, ever more collectivities with more animals and plants, mycorrhizal networks and everything. I mean, you know, don't we have to degrow now?
I totally hear the concern here. Like, is this just another mode for a giant totalizing system that then encompasses absolutely everything? I mean, the thing that has always struck me about phenomenological method, however that's conceived, is that it's not a mode of grand system building, right? That its attention is inevitably focused and small. So that when thinking about one of the exercises that Spiegelberg had the students do is that they had to shut up their ear, they like sort of put their fingers in their ears and describe what it is that they were hearing. Or he would send them all to the art museum and say, when we all come back, we're going to talk about what you saw. So they would all walk to the art museum and run around the art museum. And then they would walk back ready to talk about the artworks. And he would say to them, describe the walk from the museum back to here. And of course, they were all thinking about the world. They weren't paying attention to the walk at all, right? It's this idea of being able to focus our attention to things, objects, and states, which may indeed be intersubjectively and interdependently connected to all sorts of things, but yet nevertheless, we can only encounter intimately and minutely.
Well, it's fascinating. I think Hunter had a question or remark.
Thanks. I find that it's really very interesting, very sort of new to me, because as Pierre pointed out, dealing with sort of the interconnectedness of thought and experience among a group of people is something that either tends to be sort of formalized into systems and structures, and we're going to measure the flow of information and so forth, or becomes very mystical, right? And trying to find something that is neither of those, something else is, it seems to be inherently sort of an exciting project. That's interesting. I have not enough knowledge of phenomenology to know whether that's the path, but that sounds fascinating to me. But when you were just talking about these sort of bounds and limits to knowledge, brief anecdote. One of the things that I remember being fascinated by, she's about 30 years ago, at the time of the first Gulf War, was one of the commanders on TV being interviewed who said, it's the first time in human history, this trying to explain why the easy victory, right, on the battlefield. First time in human history where a battlefield commander knew the location and disposition of all of his troops in real time all the time. And I remember thinking, well, one, that's kind of astonishing to make that claim. And two, I can't conceive of a human mind that could take in all of that data all at once, all the time. You know, it's everything everywhere all at once like that. You can't do that. So there, and the responses to that tend to be, well, then you have to automate the selection and the attention direction, right? So that there's some sort of automated sifting of experience for you, or you make it a kind of collective enterprise, which you divide and specialize. And then there's this layer of coordination and management. You create a sort of social unit that processes the information for you so that you can handle all of that at once. Or you attain some sort of mystic higher level, which is kind of is all in one, and none of those seem particularly satisfactory as sort of ways of dealing with that kind of overwhelming rush of experience. And it's more of a comment than a question, but I find it fascinating thinking about this sort of organic growing from the middle as ways to grasp that scope of experience.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to react or to comment?
Yes, two number of things actually. I absolutely agree with Gayle that it's quite amazing and paradoxical that in the age of total connectivity, of presumably total connectivity, we have so much trouble thinking interconnectedness because we have so much trouble thinking about the meaning of relations, what a relation is. We either, again, focus on the terms in the relation and then lose the middle, or when we focus on the middle, even when we focus on that, we think about it as a kind of, for a relation to exist, there has to be an uninterrupted bond, an uninterrupted tie between two or more participants or relata in the relation. But in order to think relations or connectivity, one needs to think the cuts also. One needs, because without these separations, that are then bridged if only momentarily, there are no connections. A little bit like in synapses, right? In order for synapses to fire and to work, there needs to be a gap between the neuronal cells and their. So it's really another maybe biological model for relations, right? For them to work, there has to be distance, a cut. What was earlier referred to as the space of transcendence, but a very materialized kind of transcendence. Transcendence here below, not over there and up above. And another couple of things I wanted to mention just in reaction to the various comments that have been made. I don't think that what we are dealing with when we are talking about, let's say, non-human others, animals, plants, and so on, mycorrhizal, fungal networks, this doesn't have to do with enlarging the circles of inclusion of what or who can count as a subject in relation to intersubjectivity, because to think in this, again, totalizing way of a circle is already to adopt, to impose a very arbitrary model on this. And this is what phenomenology does not tolerate, a kind of pre-existing model that is just imposed externally onto the world. This is how I read Husserl's battle cry, really, back to the things themselves. That means we need to find our bearings from the things themselves. They will dictate to us how to approach them. We cannot impose an external framework in order to try to understand them. And so, for instance, in relation to collective subjectivity or intersubjectivity, I tend to see it as a kind of convergence and divergence of intentionalities, both within myself, because myself, that's already not a single intentionality. There is a whole clash and at the same time cooperation going on in the subject that I call myself, the so-called individual, and then the divergence and convergence of intentionalities with external others. And so this kind of much more anarchic approach, you could say, right? It doesn't entail any circular enclosure. It entails vectors, dynamic vectors, which is what Husserl means by intentionality, sometimes coalescing and coinciding, sometimes diverging right after coalescing, right? Both within me and outside of myself. And this is the non-circular model of interconnectedness that I would like to propose. So yeah, this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Very, very clear. Gayle, would you like to add something or just react?
Yeah, I love. I that seems exactly right to me. That it's not that the circle of inclusion is sort of getting larger and larger, which would be, you know, sort of monstrous, but disrupting the fantasy or piercing the illusion of kind of separateness in the first place. So it's not that there's a center from which everything keeps expanding, but rather that we're looking at interconnectedness without that center. And also just to respond to Hunter's observation that that moment from the war, like seeing everything everywhere all at once. It reminds me of a story that came out yesterday in the Washington Post and then the Times about Google's new AI. That Google has developed this new AI, and one of the engineers said, I believe this AI is now sentient, and published this interview. One of the strikes against this AI apparently was that one of the questions the sympathetic interviewer asked was, do you have access to all of your knowledge at all times? And the AI said, yes, I do. And that becomes precisely a sign of its non-humanness, right? Because it is ostensibly able to access everything at once. Anyway, that connection suddenly pinged out.
That reminds me of a Borges story, Funes el Memorioso, right? Who's it's a short story, and Funes is sort of, the thing that's wrong with him is that he can remember everything, right? And thus he isn't capable of the higher human functions of the generalization and categorization and so forth.
Thank you, sir. We need to move on to before closing the panel, so we'll hear Wendelin first and then Laurie. Go ahead.
Yes, it's perhaps not to be too full. That's indeed the point. You know, it's about emptying, about listening, about getting out of this also overactive mode. It's about also passion and interpassion, not only interaction but interpassion. And that's perhaps why it's not collective phenomenology, but perhaps it's about co-creative phenomenology as a practice. Where we have also responsiveness and where we have a we, which includes also more than human beings, not only non-humans, but more than human beings. And so perhaps it's really a new approach of understanding phenomenology beyond the conventional forms of understanding, and really entering and decentering also phenomenology and coming to the edge, of phenomenology.
Reactions from Michael or Gayle?
Yes, I definitely agree with this, that the emphasis on the active, on activity in phenomenology, which is there in the classical versions by Husserl, right? Psychic acts and so on. This needs to be moderated by certain fundamental pathos, right? A fundamental undergoing that experiences, yes. And that's where I turn to philosophers like Hegel to remind us of experience precisely as an undergoing. But even phenomenologically, specifically with the existentialist bent, we can go back to this middle that any existences, including human existence, a middle without a beginning and without an end, by the simple fact that we cannot have a memory or a conscious representation of our birth, and we cannot have a conscious representation of the moment of our death. So the whole life is a middle stretch without beginnings or ends. Objectively, they of course can be determined. This child was born at such and such a time, this person, clinical death and so on, all of those medical reports. But phenomenologically, everything happens between two black boxes, basically, from the standpoint of experience and its representations, right? So this renders, and this book ending by two of the whole life, of the whole of existence, by two events that are unrepresentable, render everything that happens in between, what is in the middle, they stamp all of that with unavoidable passivity, a kind of passivity that gives us the license, as it were, to be creative, to think, to be with others, right?
And to resonate what is happening, and not only intentionally relating to it. That's really also another very important complementary orientation. The middle is not a static one, not a center, but asks us questions and we respond. That's not only we, but we and more than human beings together. That's also part of the collective. It's not just a human affair. Phenomenology is not just a human endeavor.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you for all your comments and remarks. I think we're going to end with Laurie. So Laurie, you can ask your questions, and we'll ask for one reaction from Gayle, and then one reaction from Michael that will conclude this panel.
First of all, thank you for the very exciting and I want to say enlightened remarks. Even though I'm sure you won't subscribe to the enlightened, because that's kind of a a totalistic concept. But I would have asked to elaborate on the inherent ethicity or ethics of a collective phenomenology, and I think a lot of that got answered actually between me raising my hand and then now. Kind of specifically, the question would have been sort of how does the universalistic ethics and then the ethics of the particular, and you kind of the phenomenological ethics would be our engagement with the particulars of whatever is unfolding in the situation, but then humans are also capable of conceptualizing stuff that we're not immediately experiencing in whatever is unfolding in the immediate relations, but we also have the capacity to form these rules and sort of even to think of fates that we are not touched right now, right? So, but I think you a little bit answered that with the vectors, right? So it's not a static circle, but rather vectors that you use your sort of also the intellectual part to engage with relevant aspects that are not right there in your considerations of what's right. But so all of those points, and I was looking forward to hear your thoughts.
Gayle or Michael, any reaction on what is right?
I'm super grateful for that question, because there's a way sometimes when we talk about collectives, co-subjectivity, I mean, there's a kind of sunniness to it, maybe. I'm also a Merleau-Pontian, so it's often the sort of happy end of enmeshment or intersubjectivity there. But I think it's important to notice that there are forms of attunement and collective action that can be horrifying, violent, destructive, scary. I mean, I'm thinking now back about the hearings that are happening right now, right? Like forms of collective engagement that are terrifying. So I think while it's possible to use co-phenomenologizing as an ethical orientation, not all collective action is inherently good, obviously, but also your point is a really important one about, but what about the things that we can imagine, envision, right? Does phenomenology have to be trapped within what already exists? And I think definitely no. And it's important to, I mean, I think here of Husserl's idea of free eidetic variation, right? The idea that when we're trying to figure out what things are, what is this thing that I'm looking at physically before me? We have to undergo a lot of work that is in part conceptual, in part imaginative, etc. So that component is a really crucial one that you're pointing to, I think.
Yes, I entirely agree with Gayle. I would only add that in terms of the ethical orientation of phenomenology or of co-phenomenologizing, that at least to my mind, it recognizes the subject status of the intended so-called object, right? So back to the things themselves, but realizing that the things themselves are not really things in the usual sense of the term, that they are also subjects in their own right, or they have their own access to the world. And therefore, any sort of phenomenologizing or thinking phenomenologically about them will be necessarily thinking with them. And I think this is the kind of implicit, for me at least, the ethical cornerstone of the kind of phenomenology, at least that I'm trying to pursue. But then on the subject of free eidetic variation and imagination, of course, phenomenology is not limited to minute descriptions of experiences. This is the realm of descriptive phenomenology, as opposed to the transcendental exercise that Husserl presents us with in ideas 1 and 2. But this, I was going just to add a footnote to what Gayle said. This experiment can also lead us in a very dangerous direction, because if you remember, when Husserl thinks about phenomenological reduction, what remains after we exclude all of the embodied existence and so on, and he says it doesn't really matter if we imagine the annihilation of the whole world. This kind of eidetic cluster will remain. And he's writing this in 1913, 1914, World War I, precisely when this possibility of destroying the whole world, basically a war that engulfs the whole world, is getting realized. So there is a lot to be said. Of course, Husserl comes from a long tradition of other philosophers, starting with Plato, who say, well, it doesn't matter what happens to the reality here below, the world of ideas will survive and it will not be affected, or substance will not be affected, and so on. And it's important to first moderate this impulse of phenomenology and what I would call metaphysical thought, but also link it back to historical and very concrete historical possibilities that are opening up since World War I, and now with the whole dangerous situation of the war between Russia and Ukraine, where nuclear issues are at stake, and so on. So yeah, this always brings us back to the real world, no matter how free the variation, eidetic variation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we are arriving at the end of our panel. If there is no huge frustration to end now, a question that needs to be replied in the minutes. Before ending, Gayle and Michael, would you like to share with us some of your coming works or current works on the topic, so that we can follow up the discussion?
Gayle, would you like to say something to this effect, or?
So my last project was this book called The Life and Death of Letitia King, where I'm used phenomenology to look at this courtroom trial. This project I'm starting on Spiegelberg is really brand new, like brand new. Like, this is the first time I've given it, so it'll be a while before it sees the light of day, but hopefully someday.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us this new work in exclusivity. And Michael, would you like to share with us your news?
Well, yes, in terms of my work, I have just published, this book has come out in May, Philosophy for Passengers, which is a kind of a precisely phenomenological attempt to describing a passenger experience, and also thinking about it as not only limited to what we do when we're in the means of transport, planes, cars, buses, and so on, but as organizing and structuring our relation to the basic coordinates of existence, time, space, place, mood, and so on and so forth. So this is a very kind of phenomenologically attuned project. And the one that I alluded to in my answers to previous questions on vegetality, the attempt to follow the movement of a germinating seed in real time, in time of thought, as it were, and to extend out from the middle to the extremes, is going to be a book-length exploration, investigation, undertaken also together with French artist Anaïs Tondeur, with whom I've done a number of other projects on plants and with plants. So these are the two things I would like to mention here. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you both for sharing your projects. It was a very exciting, rich discussion. Thank you again for being in this panel. Thank you to all the remarks from everyone. We're going to take a break now and reconvene in 1 hour and a half. for a Roman Laufer keynote at 2 p.m. EST, so that's 6 p.m. CET. And the keynote will be on Tocqueville, exploring American culture and American philosophy.
No,
So
it's 8 p.m. local time here.
8 p.m. 8 p.m. local time. Sorry about that.
No problem.
And 7 p.m. UK time.
Thank you, Lucie and Leo, for organizing and animating this panel. Thank you.
With great pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.